This is what a 10-hour difference can make to a drawing, but what can it make to a game? Today I'll make the same game in 10 minutes and then 10 hours to see how far I can push it. Oh, and as we talk, I've already started.
Okay, while I'm working in the background, let me explain to you what I want to do. The goal is to create a simple jumping game where you have enemies coming from both sides going horizontally. The player can move left and right, and when you land on an enemy, you jump and destroy that enemy. The goal is to stay in the air as long as possible. It should be simple enough to make something in 10 minutes, and hopefully I can make it juicier in 10 hours. 10 minutes is really short, so I just went with the default settings and started building the player movement. The code is ultra simple. I just move left and right, and when I detect a collision, I jump by changing the Y velocity, and I destroy the thing I collided with. To spawn the enemies, I just create a bunch of points that I place outside of the camera view on each side. Then I can just grab one point at random and make it the spawning point. It's a simple but very effective technique to randomize the spawning while controlling the position. Then I move on to the enemy. I use the same node structure and pretty much the same code. They move in straight lines, so it's even simpler. After that, I go back to the main scene to handle the spawning, adding a timer to spawn enemies randomly. I also make sure to delete the enemies when they go outside of the camera, just to avoid having thousands of enemies wandering into the void for eternity. After that, I make sure I have a way to restart the game when the player goes too low. I test the game to make sure everything works and tweak a few parameters. I even have a bit of time, so I quickly add particles to the player. It doesn't look good, but hey, it's a flex, okay? And with that, the 10 minutes challenge is done.
Alright, so this is the end. Let's check out the result.
So as you can see from the gameplay on screen, first of all, the game looks like shit, but we're going to take care of that. Also, the movements are too floaty, and it's also possible to eliminate enemies when you hit them from the side. I want to change that and make it possible only when you go on top of them. At the moment, there's no progression direction, so maybe adding a score count would fix that. Oh, and in the video, you'll see me change outfit quite often because I split the 10 hours into multiple parts.
Alright guys, time to move on to the 10 hours challenge. Let's go.
So after changing a few parameters, such as the resolution, I moved on to the visuals. One of the first thing I did is add a trail to the player and also change the background to something a bit more dynamic. I'm using a shader to create stripes, and I animate them to rotate in the player's direction. It's a simple technique that should make it a bit more interesting. I wanted the player to be able to jump only on the top of the enemies, so I started working on that. I'm detecting the collision normal, and if you're not on top, I will do two things. I will use a hit effect shader to show you that you're bumping on them, and I will add some knockback force both to the player and to the enemy. In the 10 minutes version, I added an area to destroy the player and restart the game if you went too low. So I created a simple lava area using a polygon and a simple shader to make it move over time. I added some particles to show the player that the area was there, even if it was not visible on the camera. One thing that I didn't like was the static camera, so I started working on that. The first thing I did was adding some zoom in and out. Depending on the player position, the camera will zoom in or out. The second thing to make the camera more dynamic is to move it. I simply offset the camera depending on the position of the player compared to the center. And one last final trick is to rotate slightly the camera depending on where you are from the center. Those three things are adding a lot to the camera, and I think it feels already much better to play. Continuing with the visuals, I decided to animate the enemies. I created a simple animation for when they move, and I also added some particles when they're destroyed. At that point, I'm satisfied with the direction. It's already much more juicier, and we have some nice feedback for the player. I thought it was time to create some assets. I still want to keep the very simple look that I have right now, but I want some more rounded shapes, and also I think it could be interesting to make a different shape for the player, so I decided to move with a rectangle instead of a square. Small difference, I know, but still a difference. I then import that into Godot, and I work on a small animation for the player. The animation is pretty simple. I'm using a shader to deform the sprite. This is a well-known technique called squash and stretch, and I think it looks really good. From the beginning, I've been using random colors. Red is for the enemies and my player is green, but I think it doesn't look super good. So I go onto lostspec.com to get some inspiration, and then I come up with a cool color palette. And by applying that color palette to the game, I think it looks way better now. It looks way more coherent and it feels like I know what I'm doing. I think there's a nice contrast with the lava, which is bright orange.
Okay, so I'm roughly 5 hours in, and it's pretty cool. I think I'm happy with how it looks right now. It's pretty juicy. I like the colors. I changed the colors. I think it plays well, but to be honest with you, it's actually boring. It's not really fun. Like, there are some problems, and I really need to fix them because right now it's just not good. I have a few ideas on how to fix that. The first one is the spawning. I need a better spawning system. The other problem is that it's actually pretty easy to stay on top. It's easy to survive, and I want to change that. So I think what I can do is create deadly blocks, and from time to time a deadly block is spawned, and so you have to change where you are on the screen to avoid this deadly block. And finally, I have another idea. I'm thinking maybe a stomp mechanic would be interesting. So you would have, for example, you would press A and then you would stomp basically vertically. But I think it's time to work on some gameplay to make that more interesting, because honestly, the visuals are pretty much all there at the moment. Let's do that and see if it works.
I worked on a spiked enemy. For that, I simply reused the same enemy scene that I created earlier, and I create a new sprite with spikes. I make it red to make it more obvious, and that's it. When I'm spawning new enemies, I have a slight chance of the enemy to be a spiked one. I then work on stomp mechanic, which is pretty simple to implement. When you press A, you simply go into stomp mode, which removes all lateral velocity and puts you into vertical velocity until you hit something. Then your jump force is calculated depending on the distance you traveled. That way, it's encouraging the player to stomp from higher to get more height. With that, I have a game which is a bit more interesting to play. I also added a countdown at the start to avoid falling directly. I added a score counter in the background, a few effects here and there, and most importantly, I added hit stops. With hit stops, the movement is stopped for a few frames to emphasize the collision. When stomping, the hit stop is longer, for example, to emphasize the strength of the hit. I have one last thing to finish the game, and it's to add music and sound effects. For music, I use a simple loop that I have on my computer from an asset pack. And for the sound effects, to go quicker, I use a plugin for Godot, which integrates SFXR right into Godot. That way I can tweak a few parameters, generate random sounds, and I'm ready. Here is what it sounds like. And here's the final result. I think I managed to make the game juicier and more fun to play. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below and play it on itch, link in the description. I'm excited to announce that I've launched my Patreon page. By becoming a Patreon, you'll have access to exclusive content and behind-the-scenes looks at my projects. You'll also have access to the source code for some of my games. You already have access to this game's code if you're interested. I'm looking forward to sharing more with you, and thank you for your support.